again, I'm very, very grateful for your finding the time, and I'm sure our readers will appreciate what a unique opportunity that is. So thank you so much. Well, I was fascinated by your suggestion to talk about, or to start to talk at least, about the depth ecology. I read about it today as much as I could, and this is particularly interesting because this interview is for the 16th issue of the newspaper, and the 14th issue of the newspaper, the key theme was depth psychology, and my interview with Merlin Sheldrake was primarily about ecology, and I was just listening half an hour ago to your conversation with Merlin, which was very, very, very interesting. I made a
great.
Truth as an index of the right. You said that the truth as an index of right relationship, which was like very appealed to me, this quote. So,
great.
So please start by outlining what is the depth. What is a depth ecology, and let's see how we go from there.
Well, okay. Be okay if I just begin by introducing myself and my work a tiny bit, just to give the general context, and then look to find my way into that question. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So I'm David. I'm a cultural ecologist and a philosopher, or a geophilosopher, what some call a geophilosopher. That is somebody who is working out ways of thinking under the influence of a more than human Earth, thinking always in relation to the ground and the horizon. An ecologist, my particular fascination is first with the ecology of perception, or what we could call the ecology of sensory experience. That is the way the activity of our eyes and our ears and our skin functions to bind our individual nervous system into the encompassing ecosystem, as though perception itself was a kind of glue that binds our individual nervous system into the wider ecosystem. But I am, and you've been listening to some other reviews and conversations, I am also just as fascinated with the ecology of language. That is how what we say so profoundly influences what we see, or what we hear, or even taste of the earth around us. I'm convinced that there are ways of speaking that many of us have inherited from this crazy civilization, ways of speaking that function steadily to inhibit and frustrate the instinctive kinship between our animal senses and the animate earth. But I'm just as convinced that there are other ways of speaking, ways of wielding our words that can enhance and encourage that spontaneous reciprocity between our body and the breathing animate flesh of the earth. And so I'm always in my work investigating, looking to find these ways of speaking otherwise, ways of speaking that really open our felt solidarity with what I call the more than human world, the world that includes us two-leggeds, but includes as well all of the other walking and crawling and slithering animals as well as the flapping and flying folks who swoop overhead and the swimming peoples in the waters, but in all the rooted powers. This world is so much more than, and yet the human is a wonderful participant, an inhabitant, a citizen of this huge commonwealth. So that's sort of the context wherein most of my thinking unfolds.
Yeah, that was very interesting. One note that I can't remember where you said that was probably in your lecture, Language and the Perception of Nature. You quoted Richard Rorty that you were not you said that you have your disagreements with him, but it's the quote that I put down today was, "It's not these that argue well, but those who speak differently that are going to change the world." That was a nice nice quote.
It's not by arguing well that anyone is going to change the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Other by speaking differently. Yeah. I think that was a very precise insight that Richard had. So, so maybe pose your question again.
Yes. Let's use this depth ecology as a starting point for the conversation, just by delineating the subject. What are we talking about? I understand that there's ecology plus the depth psychology, and as I said, the penultimate paper was about the depth psychology. That's a very interesting. And also, I did a course on James Hillman. Just finished 2 weeks ago, and Richard Tarnas delivered a guest lecture, and that was very. I mean, I have no prior. I was trained to be economist back there. I'm trying my best to forget the stuff I was taught, but it's just out of sheer curiosity I've stumbled upon these paths and found thinkers like yourself and Tarnas and James Hillman. Yeah, so
wonderful. Well,
that's my background.
A dear friend of mine, yes, and I miss him terribly. I mean, he was an elder and a mentor, but a wonderful, very creative thinker. But so to come round to your question, what is depth ecology, or what do I mean by depth ecology? There are several ways into that. One is to just acknowledge that nearby Estonia, not so far away as I am, is the land of Norway, where my very dear friend Arne Næss coined this phrase, deep ecology, in order to say that so many of the strategies within the ecological movement and the broad environmental movement were really addressing surface symptoms of what he saw as a much deeper problem that had to do with core assumptions embedded in our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking, our ways of living in the West that inevitably were bringing about the loss, the desecration, the hobbling of so much of what we call nature. And so Arne meant by deep ecology something like beneath this shallow, as he called it, shallow ecology, to deeper levels that need to be investigated, deeper levels of not symptoms, but the deep causes. I myself, I loved Arne and we became quite close, but I was not particularly compelled by this way of framing things. And yet I noticed that here in North America, as well as in many other countries, including much of Europe, many people in the 80s and 90s were galvanized by this movement and began to call themselves and think of themselves as deep ecologists. Myself as well, because it was a way of actually saying that ecology is not just an obvious problems. There's something profound at stake that has to do with the very structures of our civilization that need to be changed at a much deeper level. But for me, so many people were drawn to this movement. I felt not because of this notion of just getting beyond shallow to deeper causes, but this notion of depth, the dimension of depth is much more interesting, I think, than any facile contrast between the shallow and the deep. That's one aspect of depth, but also depth dimension of the world that we experience whenever you're out wandering in the terrain and you notice some of the plants or trees nearby are blocking your gaze. Other things are further away. Off in the distance, there are the foothills and the mountains behind those. That is this dimension of depth that is the spread from the near to the far, off the horizon, on what photographers call depth of field, or what we sometimes speak of as the third dimension, the depth of the world. After the dimension of height and the dimension of width, there's then the depth dimension. This dimension, I think, is much more interesting than the contrast between shallow and deep. It is the contrast between flat ecology and deep ecology, between looking at nature as though we were outside it, as though it could be, as though one could see it all and map it on a flat surface of a page or the screen of a computer, or seeing nature from inside, from within its depths, as a fully embodied, embedded, moving, walking, living inside a world that envelops us, and we are immersed within it, embedded within its depths. Okay, so I began to speak of my work not as deep ecology, but as depth ecology, simply to say that that ecology, as seen as a subset of biology, inherited from the earlier natural sciences this pretense of looking at the world and looking at nature as if from outside, as if we could come to, in principle, come to a full, clear representation, understanding of how nature works, as if it was just a vast object or a complex of objects and objective mechanical processes that just need to be measured and mapped out by us, which implies that the human, or at least the human mind, or at least the scientific intellect, can somehow disembed itself from within the world and hover outside, gazing upon the world from a kind of godlike view from nowhere that sees into every nook and cranny of the real. It seemed to me that ecology, as the study of the relationship between organisms and their context, implied or it radically subverted this age-old assumption, because we humans are one of the organisms within nature, and to be looking at the relationship between organisms and their earthly environment implicates the human as well as one of the organisms, and that any instance of studying another organism, or studying a wetland, or studying a forest, is also an instance of the human relating to its surrounding material context, in a certain way, or in a kind of implicit manner. Ecology implicates the human, and I believe the human intellect, inside the very world that it studies. Mm-hmm. It really makes it difficult, if not impossible, to continue this pretense of an objective view from outside the world. So depth ecology first, for me, is signified simply this maturation within our science, within the natural sciences, from a view from outside nature to recognizing that we have to be studying nature, or rather the rest of nature, from our own fully embodied position embedded in its depths. And is that possible? And if so, how does this transform our science and our understanding, both of the earthly world and of the human within that world? But it's come to have a much richer set of meaning as well. Because I was quite aware when I began speaking of depth ecology that it also echoed the field or various disciplines within depth psychology. The world of psychoanalysis stemming from the work of Sigmund Freud, the work of Carl Jung, and there are many followers, including Jung's most follower, who was so radical, James Hillman, whose work you know. Depth psychology, studying the many layered depths within the psyche. But what began to seem very, very strange to me was the assumption that the psyche is inside us. That, for instance, both James Hillman and I were invited to come to and participate in a series of symposia on the West Coast that brought together ecologists, just a small handful of ecologists and a handful of psychologists, and these symposia were called by an author, philosopher named Theodore Roszak, who was interested in founding a new field that might be called eco-psychology. And so we came together several times, pondering, well, what most of these folks were really questioning was, how does the ecology out around us, the living landscape that is composed of so many other animals, plants, winds and weather patterns, waters, soils, how does what's happening in the environment affect and influence the human psyche? How does the world out here inform and influence what is happening deep in each individual person's psyche. And it very quickly seemed to me that this was the wrong question. That the problem really had to do with our assumption that nature is something outside us and the psyche is something inside us. This strange bifurcation, which locates all of that fluid creativity that we associate with the mind, all of that imaginative weirdness and creativity and fluidity that we associate with the psyche or the soul. We all just take for granted that this is something contained inside our skin somehow, such that I have a little psyche in me and you have your own very different psyche inside you. And then we get to argue about whether that squirrel has a little psyche inside its skull. This assumption that the psyche is inside us and that nature, which is outside us, has no psyche, that the animate earth around us is not really animate, that it is a set basically objective, basically mechanical principles and processes, just going about their thing. Any sentience without any soulful creativity or felt experience, really, and responsive dynamism and vitality. I mean, obviously, that's a ridiculous assumption, and obviously it's an assumption that has brought us to this curious and curiously terrifying impasse when so much of the earthly world is being stifled and stymied and shoved to the brink of extinction and then being kicked over the brink as a result of our human obliviousness, our human forgetfulness that there is anything in the world apart from us that's really alive, really here, creatively engaging the present moment. So it seemed much more important to me at those symposia, as I began to frame it there. Listen, my friends, why are we assuming that the psyche is inside us? Why don't we just allow that this notion of the internal reality of the psyche, that it's encased inside our skull, is an obsolete assumption, and start affirming and acknowledging that the psyche is not inside us at all. That I began to say that there is an interiority to the mind or to the psyche, but it's not because it's located inside us, but rather because we are bodily situated inside it. Because along with all the other animals and the plants and the drifting clouds, we all live within a psyche that is not ours, but is rather the Earth's. And hence, that there is an interiority to the psyche, not because it's inside us, but because we are inside it. Yeah.
That would be kind of anima mundi idea then, isn't it? Or related?
Yes. No. Yes, the soul of the world, but which is a notion really from, it's a Neoplatonic notion, James Hillman picked up on it, particularly in his descriptions of the city and cityscapes, that within a city, you actually find yourself inside a kind of encompassing psyche or soul. But I kept pushing him that it's not just within the city, and it's not just when we're dreaming asleep that we encounter the psyche, but that even when we are awake, out wandering in the world and encountering other animals unexpectedly, when you're walking in the woods, for instance, and you meet a moose who is just suddenly, and your eyes lock, and the moose shifts its shoulder, and you find your body shifting its stance, and you're getting caught in a kind of nonverbal conversation with this other, that this is a conversation unfolding within the psyche, that we need to allow, that anima mundi is not just a kind of abstract theoretical notion or vision, but today, in this time of massive ecological catastrophe, we can begin to realize that the psyche, or the anima mundi, is the soul of a very particular world. It's not the soul of the universe per se. It is the soul or psyche of Earth itself. And I mean this not in a overly spiritual manner, but that very practically and pragmatically and quite materially, that the human mind is simply our part of an intelligence that that sustains not just us, but the forests and the rivers and the oceans.
Well, it seems to me that if one of the key words of your career has been perception from the and the malleability of the perception, and what, how did you? I read your CV, and and
must be a very old CV. I haven't.
No, well, a CV like an encyclopedia article that he began, or you began exploring the application of sleight-of-hand magic to psychotherapy under the guidance of R.D. Laing. That was a very interesting because R.D. Laing was, as I said, I'm kind of novice to these ideas. I've been in that working in these with these ideas for like 4 years at most. And R.D. Laing was actually I think my first encounter with him was through Hillman. So could you please, how did you how did you get the idea of switching of I have some idea because of the notes I made today, but for our readers, how did this switch from sleight of hand magic to the psychotherapy? And could you please? That's a very that was after your extensive travel in Middle East and Southeast Asia, right? That would be.
Well, so my original craft or perception, my original profession was that of a sleight of hand magician. I put myself through college performing sleight of hand magic in cafes and clubs throughout New England, where I was going to college. I did 2 years of college and then took off a year to travel as a street magician through Europe, through France, Germany, Holland, Italy, and also through some of the Middle East, doing sleight of hand magic on the streets. But let me see how to keep this concise. In various cities, I found myself getting in trouble because I didn't have a license to perform on the streets, and so the other street performers, most of them musicians, were very upset that I was stealing their crowds because I was quite skilled as a magician. But they would report me to the police or to the gendarmes, who would then come and arrest me, and I'd have to spend the night in prison. But I would often be able to just do some magic for the gendarmes or for the police, and they would let me go soon enough, or after just enough times. But in London, when I was performing that, I had a great problem because the bobbies, the police, I would try and show them a bit of magic, and they would say, no, we don't look at that sort of thing. You just show it to the chief down at the station. We won't look at it. And so I had to spend several nights locked up there, and I realized this is not good. But as a foreigner, I couldn't easily get a license to perform. So I started working in cafes and clubs, and I was performing in one club near Hampstead Heath in London. And I was beginning to get very positive reviews in all the newspapers as this young magician. And someone who met me there asked if I would come and perform at at a party he was holding at his home that weekend, a large party. And so I was performing there, and a fellow came in, I thought perhaps a drunk from the street, who just snuck into the party, who was so fascinated with my magic, he wouldn't leave. I was set up in some corner of the living room, and various people and groups would cluster around and then move elsewhere, but he wouldn't leave. And he kept looking for hours, watching what I was doing. It turned out that this was R.D. Laing, a wild and radical psychiatrist, one of the real founders of the anti-psychiatry movement, whose work I had been reading and studying the year before, back in college. I ended up befriending him, participating in his this association he found there in London called the Philadelphia Association, as a place where people in various states of psychological distress could go and live with others without being locked up in a hospital, without being put into a straitjacket, without having drugs injected into their system, where they could live with others who were also trained just to live with them and allow them to go through whatever metamorphic, transformative process, or sometimes it was seen almost as an initiatory process. What the medical world saw as psychosis, was Laing saw it as just the organism needing to go through an initiation, or needing to go through a radical refiguration of the personality. And that if folks could learn how to just enable and be present and keep such folks from harming themselves, they could come out the other side without, and instead mainstream psychiatry was just sort of aborting this process in the middle, with the straitjackets, with the very high-powered drugs, leaving people crippled psychologically crippled, Laing felt, because he felt that madness in many instances was a sane reaction to an insane world, and that the world itself had become so out of whack, civilization had become so so catastrophically structured that sensitive people who were sufficiently sensitive and empathic were spontaneously finding themselves in these very extreme states of emotional disarray and dismay. So yes, he felt that madness in many cases was a sane reaction to a very insane situation that our society was holding us in. So I ended up working in that community, living, learning from the other psychologists, psychiatrists who were a part of that community, and just participating within it also with those folks who were in these states of fairly extreme psychological dismay. And I came to realize that sleight of hand magic was a very effective way of communicating with such individuals, that communicating without words, but through perception itself. And I think it would be a little too difficult to unpack some examples of that here in this conversation, but just to suffice it to say that I became extremely interested in the uses of magic in healing and in curing both of psychological ailments. But so I went back to college after that year traveling as a street magician through Europe, and finished my undergraduate degree, whereupon I decided to follow through on this intuition that magic and medicine have a very intimate and, in fact, a very old association, that folk medicine, healing among our indigenous ancestors and within the indigenous tribes still thriving on this planet, always involved magic in some manner or other, not necessarily sleight of hand magic, but sometimes indeed sleight of hand. And so I took off traveling as an itinerant magician through Southeast Asia, through Sri Lanka, through Indonesia, through Nepal.
Well, that was after the college, yeah? That was after the college, yeah.
So that was after I completed my undergraduate degree. Then I took off and looking to meet the traditional magicians, or dukuns, as they call themselves in Indonesia, or zankris, as they were called in the Himalaya, in order to learn from them about the uses of magic in folk medicine, in curing. And one aspect of this was quite unique, which was I was approaching these folks not outwardly as an anthropologist, as a researcher, but rather as a magician in my own right. And so I wasn't like coming to try and understand them. At least they saw it in a more benevolent manner as, wow, here is somebody who, with his own craft, seems to have some access to the spirits, some access to the invisibles. And so I was invited into their homes asked to trade secrets with them and even participate in their ceremonies and curing sessions. And I got in way over my head. And had many very hair-raising experiences. But the long and short of it was that I, in the course of living with a number of these exceedingly bizarre individuals, these shamans, these medicine people, I found my own experience of the world dramatically shifting and transforming, because these dukuns, these zankris, while they were the healers for many of the villages in their vicinity, and sometimes very far from them, people would travel for days on foot to come, or to carrying a family member to be cured by one of these dukuns. Yet these magicians did not see their work as healers to be their primary role or function within their communities. They saw it as a byproduct of their more necessary work, which was to tend the balance or imbalance between the human community as a whole and the more than human community within which each village is embedded. And again, by the more than human community, I don't mean anything supernatural. I mean the world that includes the humans and the human village, but includes as well all of the other walking and crawling and flapping and swimming peoples that surround the village, the other animals, but also all the rooted powers, the plants, the trees, even whole forests were assumed to be alive, filled with agency and creativity and sentient. But not just the other animals and the plants, but even the winds and the weather powers were assumed to be alive. Even the rocks, boulders, mountains had their vitality and sentience. And the magicians, it turned out, were those folks who were most susceptible to the solicitations, the calls, the cries of these other than human shapes of sentience. And, you know, in our culture, they would be called the sensitives. No, they'd be called the oversensitives, the folks who are just so sensitive that, you know, I'm sure you know some people like this. They feel things so much that other people percolate right through them. People who, when I have to admit, I'm somewhat like this. If I'm in a gathering and someone comes into the room, I'm not even looking at them, but they're all depressed, I may start feeling rather depressed without knowing why. Or someone else comes into a party all elated because she just got a raise, and I start feeling kind of giddy without even knowing where it's coming from, because I feel others very, very easily. It's a kind of intense somatic empathy where you pick up easily from the other bodies around you. But in a civilization that assumes that only humans are really aware and awake and sentient, this kind of sensitivity is not good for anything. It just gets you in trouble. And you get locked up, or you lock yourself up inside, and then you wake up when you're 40 or 50 and you wonder, where have I been all my life? But in a healthy culture, in a culture that knows that everything is alive, that everything is aware, yet each in its own way of life, its own style of sentience, this kind of sensitivity is very useful, because it may be too much for hanging out with other nervous systems that are shaped just like your own, other humans, but it's just right for entering into a rapport with an oak tree, or with a toad, or with a spider, or a humpback whale, or a forest edge. And this becomes then your responsibility for the community. People with this kind of sensitivity, even as their children, begin to realize that they can't just be hanging out with other humans all the time. They can't be in the middle of the human hubbub, because it blows out all their circuits. They feel too much of what others are feeling. So they naturally gravitate to the edge of the community, where with one hand, they're in relation to the human goings on, but with their other hand, they're in relation to the forest and to all the other animals and plants and beings that constitute that forest. And that becomes their charge, their responsibility, to tend the boundary between the human world and the more than human world, to live at that boundary and practice keeping it fluid, keeping it a membrane, keeping it porous, ensuring that the human community never takes more from the land than it returns to the land, whether with prayers or propitiations or praises. But that's their ongoing work of the shaman or of the magician, is keeping the boundary porous, ensuring a two-way flow, that there's always a reciprocal flow. And by virtue of doing that work, everyone within the village becomes more porous. But when illness turns up within a person, if a magician or a medicine person were just to only focus on healing the person, maybe that person would get better, but someone else will fall sick in the community. So let's heal that person, but then someone else falls sick. Let's eradicate this illness from the community entirely. Another illness will turn up, because the source of the dis-ease within the community is understood to be in the wider balance or imbalance between the community and the more than human collective in which that community is embedded. And so this was an understanding that grew in me in the course of living and learning from these folks. And when, after a year and a half, I returned to North America, I mean, and it was quite a difficult return. The culture shock was immense, but I, anyway, began to devote myself to ecology and took my, did my graduate work in ecology and philosophy. And I realized that in order to breathe in my own culture, I would have to work on behalf, not just of my own kind, but on behalf of other animals, plants, and the elemental earth. So that's a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. Thank you. So, but how did the depth psychology, I mean, you already mentioned these conferences or seminars on the West Coast and the encounter with R.D. Laing. And of course, because of my recent course on Hillman, just interested, how did you get in touch with him, and what was your if you could add something there, I'd be grateful.
Well, just I mentioned that my return to North America, the culture shock was quite extreme.
I can imagine.
But during that period, a friend of mine heard that this fellow psychoanalyst, analytic psychologist named James Hillman was giving a lecture in Manhattan. I was living in the suburbs New York, or I'd come back and was staying with my family for.
What year was that, by the way? What year was that, like approximately?
1982.
Okay.
So Hillman was giving a lecture on to the New York Psychoanalytic Society or something like that. A very prestigious lecture on animal imagery in dreams. It was his first talk on animal imagery and so I went to that lecture and then had the luck to be invited out to a meal, or at least the latter part of the evening, some drinks and some food with Hillman and a couple other people. And I was just was telling him some of my experience with other animals in Indonesia and in Nepal, but also my sense of the craft of the traditional magician or medicine person. And Hillman was really taken with this and fascinated. And we opened a correspondence between us from that moment and started corresponding back and forth. Some years later, actually decided it would be, could be very useful to see him as a therapist. And so Hillman was my shrink, as we say in the West, for a couple of years. But we were already friends at that point and had, I had tremendous, immense respect for him. And I knew that he had some real respect for me and my work. And then some years after that, we found ourselves lecturing in tandem with one another, just a couple times teaching. Or one event in particular in Manhattan that we did an afternoon and evening workshop together with folks. So we stayed in close touch. And I spoke of that particular those gatherings on the West Coast at a place called Esalen, that were the formative gatherings for the field of eco-psychology. And I remember at one of those gatherings proposing or using some sleight of hand magic to illustrate the point that I was speaking there for an hour or so, using sleight of hand to illustrate to the other psychologists and the other ecologists who were present that imagination, which of course is a notion very important to James, to Hillman, but that the imagination is, which we think of as a separate faculty within us for the creation of imagery and fantastic worlds and images and flights of fancy, that from my perspective, from a magician's perspective, imagination belongs first to the senses, long before it separates itself off and becomes a separate faculty within the mind, that the imagination is the way the eyes have of throwing themselves beyond what's immediately given in the visual field, the way the ears have of stretching beyond the surface aspects of the soundscape around, listening into, creatively listening into those sounds, or actually even feeling, if one shifts the notion, for instance, that that the world around us is basically inert, determinate, mechanical, to allow that it's all alive. if one allows that everything speaks, it's just most things don't speak in words, how dramatically that alters your hearing, because then you're hearing all these other sounds as saying something. Bird song, of course, but also cricket rhythms, but also the wind in the willows becomes a kind of voice. Also the splashing speech of the waves on the pebbled beach. It expresses something. It informs the body, infuses us with strange meanings, even though those meanings can't be translated into words much of the time. So I was showing how a sleight of hand magician depends upon this imaginative creativity of the senses, of the eyes, of the skin, of the ears, that our most basic sensorial way of engaging the world is to participate actively with the visual world, with the auditory world, with the tangible, tactile field. For instance, I know we're wandering far afield here.
No, that's okay. That's a
when we're walking through the woods, as you're walking past a particular tree, there's a great deal of that tree that you don't see. For instance, we're walking past the ponderosa pines just here surrounding my home, a little bit uphill from here, or any large tree. There's a great deal of those tree trunks that I don't see, the other side of the tree, for instance. But nonetheless, whenever you're walking through the woods, you have a sense of the other side of those tree trunks as, in fact, being a lot like the side that is facing you. Of course, you don't know. The other side may be flat and covered with shiny plastic and with red polka dots on it. Could be because you don't see it directly. Nonetheless, we tend to, the imagination of our eyes fills in that gap in what we see with a bark that's a lot like the bark we see on the side facing us. If we go around the tree, then we'll see, oh, often there is bark there, but we still don't see the inside of those trunks. Mm-hmm. And yet, I mean, we don't know. They could be hollow. They could have a bunch of rope ladders inside and little elves climbing on those ladders and yodeling to each other. But we don't know. We don't see it directly. Weirdly, though, when we're walking in the woods, we do have a perceptual feel for those trees, for those trunks, as being quite solid, because the imagination of our senses actually lends something of our own visceral density to the tree trunks we see as we're walking past. It's in this sense that I mean that imagination is just that creative edge of the eyes, of the ears, of the skin, of the sensate body. It's continually participating very creatively in the things it perceives. In that sense, I was saying to these assembled psychologists and ecologists, imagination is not first some separate faculty inside our skulls. It actually lives out here between us and the other bodies that surround us. And it belongs to the senses. It's that sensory perception is imaginative. Always. Ordinary, plain perception involves imagination. In that sense, the imagination, the place of imagination is not in us. It's right out here in the world. And Hillman, this blew his mind. He said afterwards, David, you completely rearranged the furniture in my thinking. So and these were fruitful discussions between a wonderful array of folks. But it's another, you were asking again about depth psychology. And for me, these were various ways wherein I found the experience of depth, which is the experience of immersion, of bodily immersion, that we find ourselves inside something vast, that it's as though our very goofy civilization has induced all of us to dissociate so thoroughly from our bodies that we look upon nature, we look upon the earthly world as though we were outside it, as though we were not a part of it, but were rather spectators looking at a spectacle laid out before our gaze. And so it's become very easy for us to bring about, by our lifestyles, to bring about the destruction of forests, of oceans, the filling in of wetlands for us to develop them, the damming up of rivers, because we don't really feel a part of this earthly world. Our place is not really here within it. We dwell sort of outside of it, looking at it as a kind of spectator. But the real work today, and what I think we're all called to, is to cease this dissociation from our animality, to identify more and more with our bodies, which is our own animality, to acknowledge and affirm what we've known at least since Charles Darwin, but which our old indigenous ancestors knew all too well as well, that we are animals, one of the animals here, an extraordinary animal, sure, but an animal nonetheless. If we identify with our physicality, we begin to find ourselves inside a vast breathing collective of creative, sentient, vital forces, vital lives, all these other bodies that surround us, many of them shaped so differently from ours, some of them rooted, others flapping and swooping overhead, and yet each of them is a style of sensitivity and sentience. When we begin to feel ourselves bodily in relation to all these other bodies, this is, I would say, Hardo, an experience of depth, being inside a story that is not just being written by us. It's a story that's being told by Earth itself, or a story that's being told by us, but also by the hawks and by the spiders and by the frog chorus gurgling, across the street every evening. And it's that experience. That's the real experience of depth that I think animates a genuine depth psychology, a genuine depth ecology. And it's that that all my work seeks to open and bring myself and everyone else back into.
If you just allow me one more question.
Yeah. Of course, sure. I'm fine.
One of the favorite. I made copious notes today, and one of my favorite quotes from you came from your interview with Scott London, and it said that literal truth only comes with literacy, and I think this has sort of feeds very well into your spell of the sensuous and alphabetical civilization. And could you just comment on that? Could you just comment on that little sentence here for us, please? Literal truth only comes with literacy. That was a very, yes. I very much like that one.
I'm very glad you picked up on that, because for me it's a terrifically important insight that is very obvious once you notice it, but I've never seen anybody else actually reflect upon it. But to comment on it, I need to say a little bit that it's actually been very, very central to my own research and writing and my own investigations, has been sort of pondering this puzzle. If it is normal, if it is our birthright to experience the world as animate and alive through and through. And the evidence for this is in every place-based, indigenous, oral culture that we know of. I live here in the upper Rio Grande Valley, surrounded by many Pueblo villages. So these are horticultural Native American communities. For these peoples, but also for the Koyukon peoples of Central Alaska, or the Haida of the Northwest Coast, or the Lakota people of the plains, or the Warani of the Amazon, and the Ogoni people of Nigeria, or the Sami of Northern Scandinavia, close to where you are. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the Pintubi and Pitjantjatjara cultures. These cultures are so different from one another. They are so dramatically contrasting with one another. And yet they share a few commonalities. One is that everything is potentially alive, or vitally, elaborately, excruciatingly vibrant in its vitality. Each thing that we experience is assumed to be an experiencing being in its own right. So everything is alive, and also everything speaks, just that most things don't speak in words. But if this is our ancestry, because we all have our indigenous ancestry, yes? And we all lived as hunters, foragers for the vast bulk of our human tenure within the biosphere, in very intimate rapport and relation with other natural systems. It does seem likely that this animistic sensibility is our birthright, that it is the most normal baseline human way of experiencing the world, is to experience it as something that is alive through and through, and that is expressive. Each thing expressive in its own way. But then my work has then really been faced with this puzzle. How did we ever lose it? How did we ever break out of that animate, expressive cosmos into a world where most things seem rather to just almost automatically be doing their thing? Even other animals seem like they're basically objective, not so, certainly not conscious like we humans are. But if not other animals, the plants, certainly the river, the mountain is not alive. The cloud, of course not. How did this shift come about? And I in investigating that and questioning, interrogating my own experience of living among traditional indigenous peoples, and then living back in the modern context of the over-civilized, over-educated world of Western modernity, it just became more and more apparent to me that at least one key factor that I had not seen spoken of hardly at all is writing and the advent of formal writing systems. When we speak of indigenous cultures, by and large, we're speaking of traditionally oral cultures, cultures that developed and thrived often century after century, millennia after millennia, without any highly formalized system of writing, a system of images that are coupled to the spoken language tightly, which is what we mean by writing. And so without going too deeply into that, the more I studied this conundrum, the more it became apparent that different writing systems affect our senses in different ways, but that formal writing itself dramatically transforms our human experience. Certainly it transforms our sensory experience of the earth around us, but also our experience of language and linguistic meaning. That for oral, indigenous oral cultures, as I was just saying, there is this spontaneous, almost unavoidable sense that everything speaks. So language belongs to the land, and human verbal language is just our part of this much wider conversation going on between the birds and the hedgerows and the leafing plants and even the thunderclouds. Language is a conversation that belongs to the expressive earth itself. And of course, in every region and every landscape or bioregion, this earthly discourse is quite different and is carried by many very different voices. Here in the high desert, the landscape of language is very different from that in the Amazon basin, both very different from that where you live, no doubt. But once writing comes in, and particularly once phonetic writing or an alphabet arrives in a previously oral culture, usually carried by missionaries teaching the Holy Book and wanting people to understand their ABCs so they can read the Bible. But only when the alphabet arrives in a previously oral culture does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human property. It's what distinguishes us from all the other animals. And the rest of the land begins to fall mute. It no longer seems to speak to us. This is how profoundly a simple technology like that of writing can affect our senses. Many other changes come with the written word. And of course, and forgive me, I'll just go a very brief tangent to say, of course, other writing systems like the hieroglyphic writing of Egypt or of the Mayan people, but even the ideographic script of China, where many of the written characters are derived from stylized images of humans and human implements interspersed with other animals, feline forms, cloud shapes, rain falling from the clouds. These more iconic writing systems, the written characters function almost like windows, opening the house of human language, opening it onto a landscape that still speaks, because when you read an ideographic script, the reader is continually reminded of language's link to, yes, to storm clouds and to other animals and to various landscape qualities. But with an alphabet, the written characters no longer refer to anything out there in the world at all. They just refer you back to your own face. So you see a C and you go K, and you see a D and you go duh. That is, the written characters no longer function as windows opening onto that wider landscape that still speaks, but now function as mirrors reflecting the human form back upon itself. Only with the alphabet does language begin to be experienced as an exclusively human power. We've got language, nothing else does. But what this also entails is that once you write words down, it becomes possible to see those words as labels for things. So I write down the word tree, and now I have not just the visible tree in front of me, but I have this visible word on the page, tree, and I can see the visible word as a label for the tree. Only with alphabetically writing language down does it become possible, almost inevitable, to begin to think of language as a representation of the world, that it's a double of the world. Hence, when we use language, when we're talking to ourselves, to one another, we're talking about the world, about the weather, about the trees, about the forest, about the animal I bumped into today. But I'm talking about them behind their back, because I'm not taking care to speak in a way that won't offend the mountain, or that won't disturb the animal to hear how it's being spoken, because my assumption is that they don't speak. So the use of language as a representation of the world is very recent. It's as recent as writing. It's in many ways as recent as the printing press. But it stretches back to the advent of the alphabet itself. But that's a tiny shred of our human tenure, that we've been literate and that we've had alphabets. Priorly, to speak was to participate with a speaking world. In fact, all our human languages are born in a kind of call and response with a speaking world. So it was the things that also taught us how to speak and how to speak of them. And the land still lives inside our languages if we would just peer closely, like the words we use to describe the movement of the stream between the banks would be words like gush, wash, splash, rush. But the sound that unites all those words, gush, wash, splash, is the sound that the river itself makes, that the river itself speaks as it moves between the banks. That is, our languages have always been fed by many sounds and utterances beyond the human. But our notion of literal truth, when we say, if I'm telling a friend, hey, I just had this fantastic encounter. I was walking along and I saw this boulder with all these bright, crinkly orange and yellow and black lichens spreading on it. And I focused my eyes on some of that lichen. I was peering at it and suddenly felt the boulder talking to me, speaking to me. And the friend I'm talking to says, give me a break, Abram. Do you literally mean that rock literally spoke to you? To which I would have to say, no. It didn't literally spoke to me. I'm speaking of something much deeper than literal truth. Literal truth originally means being true to the letter of the law, to the letter of scripture, to what's written down on the page.
Mhm.
It's right there in the word, literal truth. We then project that literal layer of saying exactly what is the case. We project it onto the surrounding world and think that this world is made of a set of literal facts. But literal truth is an artifact of literacy. It's born of the alphabet. The world that our senses experience, our animal eyes and our ears and our skin and our nostrils, that world is not a set of facts. It's made of stories. It's made of sensation and feeling and rich convergence and communication and clashing of sensations and friction between different impulses. But it's a shape-shifting world. It's a world that is animate and alive through and through, in which each thing is crouched in readiness to become something else at any moment. That's still our most basic bodily experience of the world. And literal truth is a very thin overlay upon that experience, I would say. But it's as recent as literacy. Sorry to go into such
No, that's
tangent.
just fascinating. That's the purpose to let you. Thank you so much for this. I particularly like what you said, that the language belongs to the land. That's a beautiful phrase, and I think that's a good candidate for the title of the interview. Thank you so much.
Good.
Yeah, thank you so much for time and generosity. And if I may, just the very last question, I would like to comment you on the little sentence by our friend James Hillman, which has my primary takeaway from this course, is that the basis.
Stick with the image.
What's that?
Is it stick with the image?
That's also a good one. But my favorite, perhaps, well, there are many favorites, but I think if I were to go to one which has affected me most, is that the basis of the mind is poetic. How would you just? I don't want to abuse your time, but I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say on that one. But a stick to the image is also a good one. Yes.
No, I mean, stick to the image. Let's set that aside. I'm afraid that I feel like that's exactly what I was saying just now.
Yeah, precisely. Yes. Yeah.
That
exactly. Yeah, that's the
basis of the mind is poetic, is just to say that literal truth is very recent.
Yeah.
And it's a very recent layer or overlay on our
precisely. That was exactly what you were saying. That's which brought this question up anyhow, but that's that's right, you already answered that.
Yes, I mean, so it's just another way of saying the same thing. Here I said, that the world as we directly experience it is made not of facts, but of stories and of feelings. But I use the word story to say something, that when it comes to voice, spontaneously in us, the world of our direct experience lives in song, in poetry, and in story. And we were telling and sharing stories long before we were trying to represent the world as a set of facts, that as something that could be objectively figured out. It can't be figured out, not because we're not smart enough, but simply because we're inside it. We are part of it. So what is far more important than figuring out how the world works, as if it were a grand machine built then by, some human-like creator outside the world, far more important than figuring it out is learning how to live well within the world.
Mhm.
And so apprenticing ourselves to the particulars of the place where we live, the unique landscape wherein we find ourselves. And even, using and beginning to apply our science and our scientific investigations, no longer to come to some big truth with a capital T of what is the world, how does it work? That's not what science really is good for. And yet science is tremendously useful and rich. And I've learned much of what I know from the natural sciences. But really, the sciences need to be investigating not that kind of finished truth, but this much richer, much deeper sense of truth of how do we humans live in right relation with the world. I am studying the humpback whale, not to learn how the humpback works, what it is in itself, but rather I'm studying the humpback to understand how we humans and humpback whales can live together, can live in proximity to one another without destroying each other. I'm studying a wetland not to figure out how it works in itself, but rather how can we humans and this wetland both flourish in proximity with one another. So truth in that sense, as an index of right relationship, needs to supersede this notion of truth as a finished a representation of the world or of the wetland or of the humpback or the spider for that matter. So the mind is I would say language itself, human language, even verbal human language, born in this call and response with the speaking world, is poetic from the get-go. It is a kind of way of singing to the world and listening for the world's reply, or singing to another person, and trying to reach across the gap of space to make contact with another shape of sentience, or calling the sun up out of the ground in the morning, as all the Puebloan peoples here do regularly at dawn. They stand in relation to the glow growing in the east, and they are praying the sun up out of the ground, as if they didn't do so, the sun might not come up. And they have that deep feeling. And that has a meaning, a rich meaning, very different from the silliness it sounds like when you look at it from a purely objective, literal state of mind. That is, if you feel like the world depends upon you and upon your attention and your appreciation and your praise, it's very hard to dam up a river. It becomes very, very hard to clear cut a forest, because all of your actions and your speaking are deployed, are undertaken to bring you and the world into greater consonance and to enable the world to continue and to flourish. It's a very, very different state of mind. And that the mind at that depth is poetic. It's about, yes, it's about singing and song and poetry, but not poetry written for poetry anthologies to sit on books on the corner of our shelf. It's poetry that here's an important point to end on, that when we identify with our animal bodies, not as disembodied minds, but as this two-legged, two-armed creature, then when we speak, we try to speak not as disembodied minds using theoretical, abstract jargon, language that has so long been uprooted from the ground that all the dirt has fallen off the roots, and our words are just don't speak to the body. And so when we're speaking, as happens certainly on most of the university campuses around this continent now, all the discourse, you can't feel it with your body because it doesn't have rhythm, it doesn't have texture. It's you have to sort of climb up into your head to make sense of it, and your body is mostly put to sleep. To speak as a fully embodied creature is to try to speak as a full-bodied animal. That is, to use language with attention to the rhythm of your speaking, to the tonality of your words, to the sing-song rise and fall of your sentences. That is, with attention to the music of language, because you're speaking as a body to other full-bodied animals. And so when other people hear you, they're drawn down from their cortex into the rest of their muscled flesh. And they become, as a result, more awake to the whole sensuous terrain pulsing around them. To become more embodied is also to become more place-based, more of your place, and to sing and to speak more in accord with the rhythms of the soundscape where you live. And I think all our languages still carry some of those rhythms of the local earth where those languages were born, not just by humans, but by humans interacting with all these other speaking beings. So I guess that's my long answer to your question.
David, I can hardly express how grateful I am for this conversation, and really thanks for the Rupert that he put us in touch, and thank you so much. And I'll try to do my best to translate it. And
yeah, I'm sorry to give you such strange, wandering.
No, that's the fun of it. That's the fun of it.
But I mean, that will be hard to translate, but
no,
I'll enjoy it.
That's all the more interesting and I'm very grateful for you, and thank you, and wish you how's the wish in English, the end of this year and the new year, and
thank you, and for you as well. Enjoy this. For me, it is a really sacred time, the dark of the year. It's a very beautiful time.
Yeah. I was just surprised that I looked it up out of curiosity and found that in Santa Fe there was about -2 degrees. I expected that. Could it be? What's the temperature now in your surroundings?
Well, you're speaking -2 centigrade?
Yeah, Celsius.
Celsius, yeah, Celsius, excuse me. Oh, it's much colder than that much of the time here in the winter.
Really? Oh, well, I thought
if I would show you outside the window. Well, I don't have my shoes on, so you won't see so well. But we got some good snowfall.
Snowfall, really?
Yeah. No. I can't live without snow. I cannot live without it. Santa Fe, yes, it's high desert. That means I live at 1.5 miles in altitude. Santa Fe is
right. Okay, yeah, that's
so it's quite high, and we get in a normal winter we get quite a lot of snow, and yeah, it's cold, wonderfly cold. How cold is it where you are right now?
It's today is -6 on Celsius, so it would be like what's the 30, 20, I don't know, 25 perhaps.
25? No, probably 20. -6 must be 20, something like that. But Do you have good snow this winter so far?
Yeah, we used to have lots of snow 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, and then it all melted, and now it has come back in somewhat reduced form, but or quantity.
Yeah. Well, here we are completely. This whole valley is dependent upon the snowpack in the mountains for the trees, the forests, the other animals, and the humans are completely dependent on good snow in the mountains. And of course, in the last 10 years, we have some winters with hardly any snow. It's a disaster for this whole terrain, and many of the trees are dying. It's going to be a very wild ride, this strange time we're now embarked on. Yeah.
Well, anyway.
Hey, will you send me the issue once it's
of course.
Here, and feel free to contact me with any questions if you have them. Okay, man.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.